Good evening, everybody. So it's a nice evening. Saturday, we have rains in some parts of India, and in Hyderabad, it's raining cats and dogs. So we have with us Dr. Maarten, Dr. Ajay Chalikwar. So we are already live. So let us start with the webinar series that is on coccidiosis management and anticoccidial rotation programs. So let me introduce first Dr. Ajay Chalikwar. Dr. Ajay Chalikwar is the technical head of Provet Pharma Private Limited. I hand over to Dr. Ajay Chalikwar to introduce the guest speaker and start the session. Over to Dr. Ajay.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It was Dr. Stephen, marketing manager of Provet Pharma, and now I would like to introduce Dr. Maarten De Gussem. Actually, this is his fourth webinar in this year, and I don't feel he need an introduction, but as a routine procedure, we need to introduce him. So, Dr. Maarten De Gussem, he has completed his DVM from Ghent University in 2000. Worked for more than 3 years in Alpharma as a technical manager. Even he has a good experience in working with the Indian subcontinent. Then he moved to Jason Animal Health. He worked there as a technical manager for 4 years, and now he is a managing director in Vetworks. Started in 2009, and he is also GM of the Vet Farm. So, Vetworks is institution managed by the experienced team of veterinarians with specialty like poultry health, coccidiosis, gut health, respiratory diseases, epidemiology, and mycoplasma. So I welcome Dr. Maarten for this fourth webinar, and as a whole fifth webinar from Provet Pharma. And in spite of his weekend there, he has accepted our request and joined the webinar. It's over to you, Maarten. You can take over.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation. It's a little bit different setting this time. So we are in autumn here in Europe. I'm taking a good warm tea. It's Indian tea, so I feel a little bit closer to you guys over there, where I think it's still good weather compared to us, although some rain is not bad. And I'm very happy to talk about one of my favorite topics, anticoccidial rotation programs in broilers. I've been starting in the industry. One of my first tasks was to cope with multi-resistance against anticoccidials in a large broiler complex in Belgium. So my first steps as a professional in the industry were related with coccidiosis problems, and so that is for me an extra reason to be very much into this subject. I have been working, of course, also with several companies that have been producing and promoting anticoccidials. One company was mainly focused on synthetic anticoccidials, what we also call chemical anticoccidials. Another company was more involved in the range, a broader range with chemicals and with ionophores. And I will be very happy to share with you my experiences with anticoccidial rotation programs in broilers and try to explain to you why it is so important to manage coccidiosis in poultry. I know there's a lot of more spectacular diseases, or people would think they're more spectacular, but I always ask people to realize that if you don't get control of your coccidiosis, you will never be a top performer. This is the most costly disease in the poultry industry on average. Obviously, if you have high mortality rates because of avian influenza, because of Newcastle disease, you have high mortality, that cost will be higher. But if you have a normal disease situation, the coccidiosis is going to be the most costly disease that you will encounter. So that is why it's so important to deal with it. Today we will talk about a couple of things. We will start to understand how is this parasite active, how is it destroying part of the intestines of the animal. What is the life cycle? We need to understand the parasite before we can discuss about the disease. And the disease, coccidiosis in itself, is a very nasty disease, but mostly today we are interested with the link of coccidiosis, of subclinical coccidiosis with intestinal health, and also, by the way, with antimicrobial used for intestinal health support. Then we understand the parasite, the disease. We will talk about coccidiosis control tools, vaccines. I will very briefly touch that, but anticoaxidials, I will go more in detail. I will also explain the different type of products, how we can make them rotate in order to remain efficacious as much as possible. And I also will give you a couple of examples of good rotation programs. And I think in the conclusion, you will understand that there's many options for you to do rotation programs. So the people that say this is the best rotation program, well, I think they are usually just bluffing, because this really will depend on the situation, on the background on the farm, on the availability of the anticoaxidials, of the cost of the anticoaxidials, of the history of use of anticoaxidials. So you will see there's a number of options that you will have, and a lot of them have bad sides and have positive sides. I will try to share with you during this webinar what are the good and the bad and the ugly on anticoccidial rotation. Okay, and I'm pretty sure we'll have some time for some questions after the webinar. All right, what is coccidiosis? We call it like one disease, but this is a little bit wrong. It's a parasitic disease. It's a group of diseases. We should say it's a group of diseases caused by unicellular parasites, which we call protozoa, of the genus Eimeria. This kind of parasites exist with every type of mammal, with every type of bird, will have its own coccidiosis parasites. There is human coccidiosis, there is cattle coccidiosis, there is turkey coccidiosis, there is swine coccidiosis, there is dog coccidiosis. Every organism has its own coccidia parasite, and in chickens we have a limitation of the number of species of different parasites that can affect the chicken, and in general we talk about 7 species of coccidiosis. All of them are important. Okay, I will explain to you the differences amongst them, but interestingly, recently there has been a paper in from Blake, Damer Blake, my good friend from the UK, and he announced the discovery of, from a genetic point of view, 3 new species on this moment, because they don't have a defined name yet. We call them operational taxonomic units, X, Y, and Z. Interestingly, they appear to exist mainly in southern hemisphere countries. Okay, it's quite interesting because it has been a long time since that we were talking about there are 7 species in chickens. We still need to find out a little bit how prevalent these 3 new species are. In this presentation, we will focus on the ones that we know very well. Again, India is also not mainly we have affection of the species, the 7 species that are mentioned here, and we will focus on these species. Okay, broilers until, let's say, about 6 weeks of age. We have about 5 species that generally occur in the farms. Of these 5 species, 3 of them we can see with our naked eye, with macroscopic lesion scoring, we can identify them, we can diagnose them in the guts. 2 of them, they don't cause lesions that are visible with the naked eye. We can find them microscopically, we can find them when we do scrapings and we put them under the microscope. We can find them by using PCR techniques, but we cannot detect these species with a normal necropsy. For older chickens, also 2 very pathogenic, important pathogens occur. They can also be scored for because they give very dramatic, good visible lesions, and these species are called Nicotix and Burnetti. Today we will focus mostly on broilers. If you would have like slow-growing broilers or indigenous species that are also used for meat production, that would grow until 100, 110, 120 days, you will also see that Necrotox and Brunetti will be able to affect this species. For the people that do a lot of lesion scoring, India is a little bit a special case because we don't have so much occurrence of Acephalina like compared with other regions, but you can find it, but maybe less prevalent than in other countries. Okay, so we say it's one disease, coccidiosis. I said, no, we should call them, in fact, 7 different diseases because all of them have a different oocyst morphology. You can see they look very much alike, but maybe they look alike to us, but to each other they don't look very much alike. Maybe it would be something like the difference between a donkey and a horse, right? Why do we say they are different? It is because there is no cross immunity between the species. Not even a mild cross immunity. There's simply no cross immunity. And that is per definition explaining why they are different and why we should call them different diseases. Because you can have in the same chicken, you can have a co-infection of the different species, but also you can have consecutive occurrence of each of the diseases. So a chicken, if you look at the 7 species here, can be 7 times ill from this family of parasites. That is why we call them 7 different diseases. These different species have a very variable reproductive potential and pathogenicity. For instance, here you would see the Amelia acephalina, the one in the F here. This is a species that is, first of all, visible with the naked eye, but has a very high reproductive potential, but is quite superficial at the villi and at also in the enterocytes. It will reside quite superficial. What is the consequence? From a reproductive point of view, that means that this can cause some pathogenicity, but because it doesn't penetrate very deep into the tissue, it also means that the individual parasite doesn't cause so much harm. Okay, if you look at this one here, what is remarkable, it is a lot bigger than this smaller parasite acephalina. It's called the Amelia maxima. And Amelia maxima, because it is so large, and also because it is residing more deep into the tissue, when it's in the life cycle, when it bursts, you will see that there's a lot of tissue damage going on. So although the reproductive potential of this parasite is lower than of this parasite, the damage and the consequences are more heavy, are more serious compared with the acephalina. Okay, so remember, different diseases, different reproductive potential, different pathogenicity. So you will be, of course, interested to know what kind of species are present on my farm, and are they very pathogenic or are they not very pathogenic? I will come back to that later. This is the life cycle of Amelia species in a schematic way. Let's start maybe with an oocyst. The oocyst is the part of is the stage of the parasite that is causing the infection in the naive bird, the bird that doesn't have immunity. And this parasite will be ingested. It will enter into the intestinal tract. By influence of acids and of the digestive tract function and the pancreatic enzymes, the parasites will burst, and there will be an excitation of 4 sporocysts, and each of these 4 sporocysts will contain 2 sporozoites. And these small sporozoites are very motile parasites that are able to invade gut cells. And these gut cells, they will start to be used by the parasites to grow and to multiply in what we call a first asexual multiplication phase. So they will just divide and keep dividing like shells in an onion. It will be built up until the whole host cell is filled with this parasite, and then this will burst, and these metazoites, that's what we call a schizont, the metazoites will be released, and they will, depending on the species, they will have one or two additional asexual multiplication cycles, and then after that, we'll have a sexual multiplication where some of these parasites will turn into what we call the male gametocytes, some other in female gametocytes, and there will be fertilization, and that is what we will call in the end the oocyst, a developing oocyst that will be released in the feces, and with the feces will find a way to the outside world. So here you can see everything here after excretion or between excretion and ingestion is outside the chicken, and there will be a next phase in the life cycle of this parasite, and the next phase will be that we have this process of sporulation. So here we have one oocyst with a amorph amount of 2N DNA. This DNA will start to organize itself first in 4 sporocysts, the ones that later on will appear again, and each within this sporocyst, also here 2 sporozoites will develop. This process, sporulation, outside the chicken, makes the oocyst almost undestroyable. Here, in this phase here, the parasite is easy to destroy. That's why you will see claims of disinfectants against coccidiosis. If you will ask the supplier, where does it work? Does it work against the sporulated oocysts? Usually we say not really. But we made a good test on fresh oocysts. On fresh oocysts that are not sporulated, these disinfectants are quite effective. But once they are sporulated, almost impossible to destroy the parasite. They also will become in a very low metabolic rate, so they have a limited amount of metabolic processes once they are sporulated, so they are not so vulnerable of the effect of the environment and of disinfectants. Okay, so this means that for the sporulation, this is the period of the parasite being vulnerable, but usually this is also the period where the parasites are still present together with the chicken in the chicken house. Because at 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of age before slaughter, there will be shedding of these parasites. The moment that the house is empty, let's say 42 or 45 days, whatever is the type of reproduction, at that moment, this sporulation will has been finished for most of the parasites, and they almost become invulnerable. You can still wash them away, but destroy with disinfectants, almost not possible. You can freeze them, you can burn them, but you cannot chemically destroy them. The sporulation process is depending on a couple of factors. It's a very metabolic, intense process, and the parasite will need oxygen, will need water, humidity, and will need a certain temperature in order to be effective. Don't worry about India. You have the perfect conditions in terms of temperature in most cases for the parasites. Humidity, also very important. That is why in many regions in India, the peak of coccidiosis, not only in India, but also in India, the peak of the coccidiosis will also very often be linked with rainy seasons with a lot of humidity. In the dry season, very often we see that the sporulation process is not so effective because we lack humidity. This means that some of the parasites will die, some others will need more time for the sporulation. The optimum time in the optimum conditions is about 3 days. But if you don't have the right temperature, if you don't have the right amount of oxygen, you don't have the right amount of humidity, it can be prolonged to 10 days, 14 days, and that would slow down the development of the disease. Because a non-sporulated oocyst, if it is ingested by a bird, it cannot infect the animal. It will just be released to the intestinal tract and it will disappear in the environment. All right? Okay. A lot of information, I know, but it's important for you to understand the life cycle of the parasite. Remember, not easy once the sporulation is done to destroy the parasites. Where can we attack the parasites? When it is very active, multiplying, that is inside the chicken. And you will see that inside the chicken, so outside the chicken, we are checking disinfectants. Again, not so effective. Inside the chickens, we have two ways of attacking the parasites. One is by using chemicals or ionophores, products that are toxic for the parasites, but not toxic for the host. Or we can work by triggering the immune system. The immune system can also kill the parasites. These parasites are very immunogenic. Okay? But of course, this is going to be a balance between the immune system and the parasite. And usually what we do is we combine the methods of using toxic compounds to control the parasites and the immune system. We are using the two strategies at the same time. I will explain that later on in this presentation. When a vet is going to see the birds and he's opening the birds, you will see this is a schematic way. If this is the cloaca, this is the tuchica, this is the gizzard, duodenum, mecus diverticulum here, and the duodenum and the ileoinum is occurring here. You will see that each of the coccidia likes to choose a certain location in the gut. It's a bit strange because if you take cell culture, they all will invade the same cells. But when they are put in a chicken, the acephalinia will not go to the chica. It will go to the small intestine. The maxima will typically go to the midgut, although sometimes we see them a little bit more also cranial in the duodenum. Tenella, you will only find back in the chica. Yeah? We don't really know how and why these parasites are doing this. But we think it has to do with receptors that are being expressed by both the host and then receptors on the side of the parasite that are able to find that perfect location for that parasite. Okay? Imidaprecox, one that doesn't cause these macroscopic lesions, is occurring in the same location like acephalinia. Brunetti is occurring at the last part of the gut. Mitis, the same location like maxima, but not causing these macroscopic lesions. And Negatrix, also the same location like maxima, maybe a little bit more further down also to this direction of the chica. Very pathogenic also. And again, we don't really know why they each choose the different location, but I can also tell you there is an interaction between the parasites if they want to assess or they want to nest themselves in the same location. All right. So this is what we call a crowding effect. So when, for instance, there's a lot of acephalinia, we will expect also that the maxima levels would be lower because there will be some competition between the species, and the more acephalinia, the less maxima is able to establish itself in that intestine. Again, we don't understand the reasons, but this is an important aspect of the coccidiosis, and how it can spread in the birds. Okay. Now, the consequences of coccidiosis. If you ask to any chicken farmer, do you know coccidiosis? What will be the answer? Yes, I know coccidiosis. I have seen it. Every farmer knows coccidiosis as a clinical disease. A clinical disease means there is a high mortality. There is a visible clinical sign, which is very classic for Aemia tenella, blood in the feces. We see birds with a very poor condition. Look at this poor animal here, with ruffled feathers. There's loss of appetite. There's a poor performance. There's very often diarrhea. Okay, the birds are really ill, so we call it a clinical disease. Very well known, but people forget that this is kind of a tip of the iceberg of the disease. It is not so common to have this high clinical cases. Um, Not only in a population in a house level, but also within one house, some birds might have this, but not all of them. Okay? If you have from time to time clinical coccidiosis, bloody signs of coccidiosis, this means that you really have to do something about it urgently, because it means you're losing a lot of money. Okay? Most of the customers I have would only rarely see clinical disease. For me, if I have a farmer that has more than 2 times per year clinical problems with coccidiosis, for me, it's a disaster farm. I can never bring it to the level that I want to bring them. So if you have this kind of farms, really you have to do urgent action. Okay? I will talk about that later, what kind of actions it could be. I'm worried about clinical coccidiosis. And there are cases. But I'm not so much worried about the clinical coccidiosis compared to the subclinical disease. Why? The subclinical disease, it's damaging epithelial cells, and we need this gastrointestinal epithelial cells to do the main job of a broiler chicken. It is to convert feed into meat. If we don't have that good conversion, that means that we will spend too much feed for the same growth. And the problem is that the farmers, they will not care. They will not see it, because you could see it maybe when you do necropsy or with an electron microscope, like I showed here. This is an ileum of an unaffected turkey poult, normal one, turkey. It's very similar, like from chicken. This is one picture from a subclinical coccidiosis. No mortality, no visible signs at all. Can you see the amount of destruction in this intestine? Can you understand that if the feed is ingested by the animal, how poorly the digestion absorption will be? How much money will be lost on this location? Okay? So the problem with the subclinical disease, which for me is a lot more important on a global scale than the clinical disease. The problem with the subclinical disease is that people don't recognize it. You could have a very good farmer that is suffering from subclinical coccidiosis for 30 years, and he has never realized it. He has never realized how much money he has been throwing away by not handling the subclinical coccidiosis. It's 100% prevalent in broiler production. I don't know any chicken house without cocci pressure, except maybe if they are put in cages. Okay? But even on slats, I've seen countries and they come to me and say, Dr. Maarten, don't worry about coccidiosis. We know you like coccidiosis as a disease, but you don't need to come here for this. You can come for other things. But we don't have coccidiosis because we are raising them on slats. There's no litter. Then I open the birds and I can show them they are wrong. There's 100% prevalence in broiler production. Okay. Again, not if you can really work in cages in a very clean environment. You could have some flocks, but all the rest, everything that is put on the ground, there is coccidiosis. Trust me. Maybe a low level, maybe a medium level, maybe a high level of subclinical coccidiosis, but there is some coxy. And what is important is to measure that. Because yes, you could have a case where you have low levels of coccidiosis. That means you can do with, let's say, very cost-effective control measures. You don't have to spend too much time and money on it. Or you could have high levels of subclinical coccidiosis, where for you, it's probably very financially interesting to invest more in your coxy production. But you have to measure the levels in order to make the decision. But don't come to me and say, there's no coccidiosis in my farms, because I will be able to demonstrate the opposite to you if you allow me to investigate your birds. Okay? What I want to hear as an answer is if I ask you, do you have Coxy levels? Yes, we have Coxy levels. We have measured it in a proper way, and we can tell you if it's low, medium, or high. Then I will believe you. But if you say there's no Coxy, sorry, I will not believe you. What are the consequences? Reduced nutrient absorption, poor performance in terms of weight and feed conversion rates, poor uniformity. We don't like that in broilers, but we don't like that for sure also in layers and in breeders. And there, Coxy, we don't care so much about the feed conversion rate. We are much more worried about uniformity because, especially in breeders, it's very hard to define the right levels of feed to the birds if there's poor homogeneity, poor uniformity of the flock. Today, with the ban on antimicrobials, on antimicrobial growth promoters in many countries, or the desire of some groups of consumers to have a different level of antibiotics used. But also, if you're able to use antimicrobial growth promoters, we understand that one of the main effects of the coccidiosis is not only direct damage as demonstrated here, but also the predisposing factor that coccidiosis plays on secondary diseases like necrotic enteritis caused by some strain of Clostridium perfringens, and also the famous bacterial enteritis, clostridiosis, dysbacteriosis, dysbiosis, complex disease. Okay, we see there that the main driver, the main instigator for this disease is indeed coccidiosis. Then you will ask me, I believe you, what is the average loss, so the medium level of Coxy levels of coccidiosis damage? What is that costing to the poultry industry? I always talk about 10 euro cents per 2.5 kilogram broiler bird. This is average. If you have a lesion score, total mean lesion score, it's the sum of the acephalina, maxima, and tenella lesions of about 1.1. So let's say between 1 to 1.2. This is my personal estimation of the cost of coccidiosis. Okay, this is based on several trials that I've been doing in the past. First of all, to measure infection, but secondly also to see how you can solve the losses, how you can reduce the losses. This is my personal estimate. Interestingly, recently, my good friend Dr. Blake, but I just mentioned also before, that discovered this 3 new species of coccidiosis, he just released, a few weeks ago, he released a paper talking about the cost of coccidiosis, and he made a couple of calculations, meta-analyzed from different trials, and he doesn't say 10 cents, euro cents per broiler. He even estimates it to be 18 euro cents for an average loss of a broiler in today's poultry industry. I don't want to debate on that. I think if you would agree for your calculations that you make to see in your farms what is the level of coccidiosis, and then you decide if you're higher or medium or lower, that you go somewhere with a amount of money that you're losing between 10 cents to 18 cents, I think you will have a very good estimate. Okay, so that means that in a broiler shed, even one of 5,000 or 10,000 birds, on average, we are losing 500 euros for a 5,000 broiler shed. It's a huge amount of money. 10,000, 1,000 euro for a 10,000 broiler shed. It's a dramatic losses with coccidiosis that you can imagine. Okay. I told you about this link between coccidiosis and bacterial enteritis and ectopic enteritis. I just want to briefly and quickly explain to you how that works. If you have, at 14 days of age, you have a normal gut with well-developed villi, and you will see the enterocytes lining this villi, a certain moment in time, there will be an infection of the coccidiosis from the previous cycle of birds raised in the same shed. And these little parasites here, represented by a ball, they will invade this epithelium, and this coccidia will cause that gut mucosa to react. How will the gut mucosa react? In fact, there will be three reactions. The first one is that this long villi that we like to see very long and very nice distributed over the gut. You've also seen here this electron microscopic picture here in 3D. This villi, they will start to fuse and shrink. Okay, why? These parasites are attacking the surface of this villi, and the intestine tries to avoid that the surface is to be reached by the parasites, so it will limit the surface by fusing and shrinking the villi. That goes very quickly after the attack. Within a few hours after the attack of the parasites, this will happen. You will say this is fantastic. What a very intelligent response of this gut mucosa to that nasty attack of these parasites. Now, this is true. I told you about the coccidia that can occur in humans or in dogs or in other animals. In this kind of animals, this reaction is very intelligent, because at the same moment, there will be also a second and a third effect. The second effect is there will be more mucus cells that are going to produce mucus to protect the damaged epithelium. So a lot of these goblet cells, what we call goblet cells, will start to produce more mucus, and they will cover this villus. And the third thing that will happen is an immune reaction. So the immune reaction will be triggered by the damage done by the coccidia, and that, of course, will cause a couple of positive effects. And in normal animals, what happens in a dog or a human, what will happen when this inflammation is activated? There will be a signal to the brain of the animal or of the human, and this signal will be there is inflammation. And you all know what happens when there's a lot of inflammation. Your appetite goes down. All right? And that's very important, because the first thing that happens is this villus fusion. Yes, it is safe to avoid the attack of the parasites, but of course, it will cause a reduction of digestive and absorptive capacity of that intestine, right? And that means that it doesn't make any sense for that animal to ingest a lot of feed, because it cannot be digested anyway. Even more so, what we know today is that this ingestion of feed is quite dangerous, because if feed cannot be digested and absorbed by the host, you know what will happen? There will be a shift in the microbiome. The shift in the microbiome will go from what we call the good bacteria, and again, this is a presentation of coccidiosis. I don't have time to go in detail about what is going on, but the change will go from a good microbiota, and we will start to stimulate bad microbiota components. And this bad microbiota, why are they called bad? Because they will disturb the normal interaction between the hosts and the microbiota and the nutrients that are present in the gut, and they will start to produce metabolites, gases that are toxic for that intestinal wall. And you will see that in this broiler chicken that is selected for this high feed intake, that immune reaction is not causing that reduction of feed intake in the brain. These birds continue to eat. They should stop eating because there's damage in the gut, but they don't do that because they are too much selected to be happy to keep on eating, even when they're already sick. So they keep on eating, and they cause this bacterial enteritis, sometimes leading to more clostridial growth. And if you have bad luck that you have a strain in your house or in your bird that is able to produce some toxins that cause necrotic enteritis, this will turn into a necrotic enteritis case. All right. It's a very well described link between coccidiosis as the main predisposing factor between NE and bacterial enteritis. And I can tell you the cost of the disease, of the gut health disease, is about doubled when it is combined between the Coxy and the bacterial enteritis. This means that with my 10 cents or the 18 cents of Damer, Blake, we estimate another amount, similar amount of 10 cents to be lost by the consequences of the bacterial enteritis, the increased inflammation, the immune reaction that is going down, and another series of events that cause even poorer digestion and absorption on top of the poor digestion and absorption caused by the parasite itself. Okay, very important link. Remember, if you want to learn more about this bacteriosis, bacterial enteritis, we developed a scoring system in 2010, about 10 years ago, showing the ballooning, poor gut contents, poor tonus, here in this C2 example compared to a normal tonus, thin, fragile guts, inflamed guts, a lot of undigested feed particles in the end. Very often this condition has been preceded by a subclinical coccidiosis problem. Very often what you will notice is this type of undigested feed particles in the litter, and you will say, this is a bacterial enteritis problem, but people will not realize that the original reason of this bacterial enteritis was that coccidiosis that was preceding this disease. Okay, so remember also in this case you should really investigate your Coxy levels, because I have not seen a lot of cases of bacterial enteritis where coccidiosis has not been involved. What could be other instigator for bacterial enteritis? It could be really poor feed quality, it could be viruses, it could be mycotoxins, but the most common is going to be the coccidiosis. All right. Yeah, I discussed this more or less. So this vicious circle of pathogenesis of bacterial enteritis, remember, high feed intake, nutritional factors, coccidiosis, mycotoxins, viruses, causing this oversupply of nutrients in the lumen. So it cannot be absorbed by the host. That causes this shift in microbiota. We have this bad bacteria that start to produce metabolites that damage and trigger the gut to change. Villus fusion also from the parasites originally. Villus fusion, inflammation, more goblet cells. This means a less functional gut, even causing more poor digestion and feed and absorption of nutrients. And that again, if you don't reduce that feed intake, which we don't want in the poultry industry, we want the birds to eat a lot, will cause more oversupply of nutrients in that lumen. Okay, going back to the coccidiosis, what kind of control tools do we have? Well, first of all, the first tools that we originally had in, let's say, the 30s, 40s of last century were the sulfonamides. First, there was a very, let's say, basic type of treatment based on sulfur. The first researchers saw there was some effect of sulfur on coccidiosis, and the moment they start to develop the sulfonamides, that's in the 30s. That happened in the 30s for, of course, for antibacterial treatment. But very quickly it was noticed that also the sulfonamides had a anti-parasitic activity against this protozoa, and that has caused the start of the growth of the poultry industry globally. Because before that period, it was not possible to keep large amounts of groups of chickens, let's say more than 20, 30 chickens. It was too dangerous. A group of 200 chickens in one house, oh my goodness. This could lead to massive coccidiosis outbreaks and to huge losses because there was no drugs for coccidiosis. That is why before that age, a typical chicken farm was containing the groups of the animals in small batches, in small pens, to avoid the rapid spreading of the coccidiosis. It's only when the sulfonamides came as a treatment, as a metaphylactic and preventive tool, that farms were able to start growing. Okay, we still use the sulfonamides, fantastic type of drugs. You be careful a little bit with toxicity and so on, but still quite active. Not too much resistance to coccidiosis, but of course we have new drugs for therapy, toltrazuril, amprolium. All of them go very well in the drinking water, and that is of course what you want in therapy for coccidiosis, because with the Coxy we will see there will be a reduction of feed intake for the birds that have really the high level of disease. But I said here about inflammation and the impact on the feed intake, that's true, but not of course if the bird is really facing a clinical coccidiosis like what you see here, then this bird will stop eating for sure. Okay, so that means this bird cannot be treated anymore, except if you go to the drinking water, hoping that the water consumption will still be active. But again, therapy, I use it. Of course, I have customers who have clinical coccidiosis, but of course, if you have to use therapeutics, that means that you come way too late for the prevention of your problem. Okay, if you have a farm and you have to, on the same house, you have to treat 2 times per year or more for coccidiosis, I can tell you, you have a problematic coccidiosis level. Okay, you should really do something about changing the way that you handle coccidiosis on this farm. And I know some farmers, they get used to it. They say, oh yeah, I treat every cycle for coccidiosis. And I'm telling them, oh, you're losing so much money. You should have been doing something about that way long before. Okay. Alternative products, I have been trying a lot for people that want to develop phytoproducts, products for coccidiosis control. I can tell you, I have not found any that can have a direct effect on coccidiosis. Some of them, they might alleviate litter quality issues, they might alleviate appetite issues, so they might have a symptomatic impact. Or if you impact the litter, remember, you can slow down the infection pressure outside the animal, but I haven't seen phytoproducts that worked directly on the parasite. So be careful by using this type of products for prevention of coccidiosis, because you could fool yourself. All right? Have I said that it's impossible that phytoproducts can be active against coccidiosis? Absolutely not. Things that come from nature can work. The best example are these ionophores. Ionophores are products that come from nature. They are produced by fermentation. So they can be found in the nature, and they work pretty well for coccidiosis. So yes, it's possible. But really the phytoproducts itself, I haven't seen any. Vaccines, I will come to that very briefly, because I think in 2020, we need to realize there is a need, or there's an effect, there is a role for vaccines to be played, but 90% of the birds in 2020 worldwide are treated preventively in the feed by use of anticoaxidials, where we discriminate 2 products: the chemical products, which are synthetically produced, and the ionophores, which are produced by fermentation, with one very big additional advantage. Next to the antiparasitic effect, they also have an antimicrobial effect, a bit like the sulfonamides. Okay, vaccines. Coccidiosis, inactivated vaccines don't work. Okay, clear? Only live vaccines can work by stimulating the cellular immune system. We use them a lot in breeders and layers, in slow-growing broilers, and more, we see they are cost-effective in standard broilers that have high infection pressure due to resistance. Okay, if you have resistance to all the types of drugs that we will talk about in a minute, then using vaccines makes sense. But if you have very efficient anticoccidials, it's always more cost effective to use an anticoccidial than to use a vaccine. Okay? Do you routinely plan and implement anticoccidial rotation programs in your farm? I think that is a question for the audience. Please feel free to answer. We can discuss that later as well. Um, if we talk about vaccines, what is the idea behind that we are using now? Vaccines more and more also in broilers. It is to replace resistant field strains with sensitive vaccine strains that occur in that vaccine. Again, this is a principle. You have a lot of reds here, that is resistant strains. If you start to use vaccination, you try to push away the resistant strains, and you try to become to a sensitive population, and then you return to the anticoccidials. Okay, why? Because the coccidiosis vaccine is a live vaccine, so per definition, it will cause a subclinical coccidiosis infection. That means that we always have some damage in that gut, and that is why we expect to have some levels of bacterial or necrotic enteritis when we are using these live vaccines. Okay, so for a temporary solution, they can be welcome, but on the long term, we always want to optimize the program by rotating with anticoccidials that go through the feed. And if you don't have resistance, if you have a good history of use of anticoccidials with good rotation, that you don't have resistance, then yes, your anticoccidials will always be more cost effective because you don't have that subclinical cocci levels that you have like with vaccination. Okay? Ionophores. Ionophores are really interesting because they are having both this antiparasitic and antimicrobial activity. In the US, that has led to some producers to say, I want to put on a label for my chicken, no antibiotics ever. They will not be able to use ionophores anymore. They can still use synthetic anticoccidials, but not ionophores. Norway has banned ionophores in 2016, and in Asia, there are some countries start to ban AGP. Some also restrict anticoccidials, especially ionophores. Sometimes they restrict it, not completely, but they ask for they ask for a prescription of the veterinarian. So you see there's a little bit of pressure on the ionophores, although there's no link with antimicrobial resistance in humans by using ionophores. There's only advantages by using them, but sometimes they become under pressure for a wrong reason. Anticoccidials are used for different animal species. Remember, a vaccine, every single species that you want to protect for should be in the vaccine, otherwise it doesn't work. But this broad spectrum anticoccidials in the feed usually work against all the species that could be present in that farm. By the way, if you talk about OTU, that also would mean that we expect that these anticoccidials would be working against this new species as well. Whereas for the vaccine, you should make a new vaccine, including this OTUs. All right. But what I'm saying to you is that there's only advantages to anticoccidials. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. There's one big issue that we see with anticoccidials in the feed. It is that the parasite can become resistant to it. That means that the main task that we have when we design anticoccidial programs, that we try to avoid reduction of sensitivity. Okay, there's no company in the world I know about that is producing a new active, a new family of products. So that means that we have to live with the products that are on the market today. And if we overuse them, or we use them in a bad way, that we instigate resistance, we lose them. And the best way, the best proven way to avoid resistance is by rotating the molecules before they turn resistant, and also allowing the parasites that have developed resistance, allowing them to regain sensitivity. Okay, so dissolution for the negative aspect of resistant development with anticoccidials is rotation. Okay. Okay, here you see different types of products. I just give you some examples. That there's more anticoccidials on the market than this, but these are really the main ones. You have the ionophores, the fermentation products, salunomycin, monensin, narasin, the monovalent ionophores, and the madromycin and the centromycin, and the lactulose as divalent ionophore. And then we have chemical products. I don't like that word chemical so much because also ionophores are a chemical compound, but a lot of people would call them chemical products, which are synthetically produced. Robinidine, diclazidine, halofigenol, decokinate, nicarbazine, metoclopridol. And then we have combination products. Usually it is one ionophore, one synthetic, very often combination with nicarbazine. Nicarbazine on itself, also a combination of two mode of actions, reducing the amount of resistance. So what I told you is, what are the issues? First of all, it is that reduced sensitivity, that resistance. After some time of use, the efficacy of all the anticoccidials decrease. You can dream of an anticoccidial where it doesn't happen. It is not there. There is abundant scientific material to show for any of the anticoccidials on the market resistance, including nicarbazine. I know that some companies claim that they have a superior anticoccidial and that there is no resistance with this anticoccidial. That's nonsense. All right. I have had in my hands for strains resistant to any of the anticoccidials that are available, and we have shown it by doing sensitivity trials against this parasites against different anticoccidials. Okay, that's logic. These parasites have huge amounts, and like with bacteria, and like with viruses, it's normal when you start using a product that resistance will generate. It's not a drama, but don't ignore it. Don't say that it's not possible, because then you're just ignoring the reality. Okay. The second thing is the knowledge. What is the main issue? The knowledge between the cross resistance of the different products. Between these combinations here, or between these different products here, there are some relation of mode of action between these compounds that explain why there is cross resistance amongst some of them. I will explain to you that in a minute. Okay. So this reduced sensitivity resistance, what does it mean? You have a parasite population. There's many of them, so they have a variation of sensitivity to a certain anticoccidial. If you have low sensitivity and you start using a certain anticoccidial, well, it's quite clear. The ones that are sensitive to the parasite will be killed, and the ones that are less sensitive will survive. Fortunately, for almost all the anticoccidials, to have that resistance here, to be red, usually means that the metabolism of the parasite is less efficient than the ones that are in yellow. They need to use other pathways in the cell in order to escape the mechanism of the anticoccidial. That also means that if you don't use this anticoccidial, the ones that are sensitive are what we call more metabolic fit. And they will have a higher reproductive rate than the ones that carry the resistance. This means that when you use an anticoccidial, you will turn the population into resistance. But fortunately for us, it also means that when we take out the anticoccidial of the regime of the feed for a longer period, when we take it out, when we make a rest with this anticoccidial, this population will turn more sensitive. Fortunately, otherwise we could throw away all the anticoccidials in the trash bin. All right. One important point is, and a different point is between the chemicals and ionophores. Chemicals are superior molecules compared to ionophores. It means that when you use a chemical, you will not expect to see any oocyst surviving the action of the chemical. All right. Ionophores have what we call a feature which we call coccidial leakage. Even if the parasite is sensitive, not all of them will be killed by the ionophore. Some of them will simply survive. That is what we call coccidial leakage. So if I ask you, what kind of molecules should you choose? Well, it's quite clear if you look to the slide. I will say chemicals. Of course, they work better than the ionophores. Funny enough, the ionophores have become the most popular type of anticoaxidials worldwide for many years. There is a reason. The strength of the chemicals is also its weakness, because there's no such population which only contains sensitive parasites. There's always going to be some kind of a mutation where resistance is present. And then when you start using this chemical, you will have a very rapid conversion of the population into a complete resistant population. The ionophores, the weakness becomes the strength. Because when some resistance occurs with these ionophores, there still will be competition between the sensitive strains that are occurring because of the coccidial leakage and that resistant strains. That is why we see that this resistance development, if you look at efficacy for chemicals, let's say 100%, they're a lot better than the ionophores. But once we start to see resistance, very quickly we'll have a complete resistant population, sometimes with the potential of causing dramatic outbreaks. So if you overuse a chemical in time, if you use it too long, you can create disasters. If you look to ionophores, where if I look today to the data that we have, we would say the efficacy around 40 to 60% of the parasites. Well, this is what we call the coccidial index. That the parasites will be controlled. We see that this, if you keep using this ionophores for a longer time, you only gradually will have that loss of efficacy. On this moment, most ionophores I know work between 20 to 40%. And still, we are happy. We are quite happy with that efficacy. If you go below 20%, you will start to see these clinical outbreaks. But we try, of course, to get our ionophore efficacy as high as possible by using that rotation. I will explain it in a minute. Okay. Cross resistance, I will be very short. Between the chemicals, don't worry too much. All of these chemicals have a different mode of action. There is some confusion between diclazeril as a preventive molecule and toltraziril as a therapeutic, but except for that, there's no cross resistance between these molecules. This means that if you can use 3 months of robenidine and then you use 3 months of diclazeril in your feed mill, there's no problem. The robenidine will not teach the parasites how to escape the diclazeril and vice versa. With ionophores, it's a very different story. They have a similar mode of action, and that means that cross-resistance may become a problem, but we see differences between the different classes of ionophores. How does the ionophore work? If this is the parasite cell wall here in the middle, you know it's a lipid layer. Okay, it's lipids. Why is it lipids? It's to keep homeostasis. We don't want the ions that are present in that watery environment outside the cell and inside the cell. We don't want these ions to just go up and forward through this lipid layer. Why? It would destroy the homeostasis of that cell. Ionophores, they work like ion channels. In this picture here, they are cut through transversely, but you have to see it more like a 3D picture, that they are in fact a spheric molecule. And these ionophores, they work like this spheric molecule that from the outside, they are lipophilic. And the inside is hydrophilic. This means that they will be like a ball, and they can cross through this lipid layer that is presented here in this picture. But on the inside, they can carry the ions, and they can transport the ions from the outside to the inside and the other way around. So what will they do? Depending on the concentration of ions inside and outside, they will disturb the homeostasis of that parasite. So what happens in the beginning, this is a parasite. In the beginning that it happens, this parasite will start to correct this disruption of homeostasis by using a sodium-potassium pump, okay? And this sodium-potassium pump will need energy, okay? And the moment that the energy is exhausted because of the continued presence of this ionophore, so they work slow. If you compare, for instance, with some chemicals, these parasites will work pretty slow. That's why they have to be put in there continuously. That's also why they were never developed as a therapeutic compound. But when they are exhausting that sodium-potassium pump, certain moment in time, there will be an influx of ions, and water will be attracted, there will be osmosis, and there will be a very simple destruction by bursting of the cell. Okay. Now you can imagine that if the parasite becomes resistant, yeah, it will become resistant against this general mode of action. So there will be cross-resistance amongst ionophores. There are some differences. Okay, saloninomyces is not the same like monensin or like maderamycin or lactobacillus. How can we explain that? Well, these ionophores, they cannot just carry one type of ion, they can carry many types of ions. And they have a different selectivity depending on the molecule. For instance, two very different ones are monensin and lactobacillus. You see that lactobacillus here is able to carry divalent ionophores. They can also transport sodium, for instance, like monensin, but monensin will preferably transport sodium, whereas for lactobacillus, that is only much later, much lower in selectivity. So that explains that this cross-resistance within a certain group of ionophores is quite high, but there is still some differences between molecules, especially between different groups of ionophores, where we discriminate three big groups: the monovalent ionophores, saloninomycin, monensin, narasin; the monovalent glycoside ionophores, madromycin and cendromycin; and lactobacillus as divalent ionophore, where the potential for cross-resistance amongst monovalent ionophores is the highest, and between the classes is a lot lower. So if you want to avoid this resistance to be trained and to be transmitted from one category to another one, what do? We do rotation. And when we do rotation, we recommend to try to make a variation between different chemicals. Remember, no cross-resistance between different chemicals. So you can rotate from robenidine to diclazidil to dicaconate to dicarbazine. But if you rotate between ionophores, we recommend to rotate between the classes of ionophores. Don't rotate from saloninomycin to monensin, because they are basically in the same category. Try to rotate from a monovalent to a divalent, or to a monovalent glycoside to a chemical. And if you have resistance issues, also include vaccination in between to restore the general resistance to all these parasites. Okay, so why do we rotate? Well, we rotate to give also the opportunity of these molecules to regain, of this, not of the molecules, but the parasites to regain sensitivity to the other molecules. For instance, you can imagine you use one molecule, there's some resistance, then you start to use another one. In the meantime, the first ionophore here can regain sensitivity. Okay, so rotation helps anticoaxidials to restore the efficacy. All right. Yeah, I explained that already. So don't forget this cross resistance. The second reason why we rotate, especially for the chemicals, is to avoid this here to happen. Going to complete resistance. Okay, that's also why if we make rotation programs and we indicate the duration of use for an anticoccidial, we are extremely strict on the time you can use a chemical. We are a little bit more flexible on the time you can use an ionophore. Okay, so when we indicate this is the maximum period you can use this chemical, please keep to that advice really strictly. With ionophore, if I say 6 months ionophore, and you're going to use 6.5 months I'm not going to be very angry. Okay, but don't exaggerate. Okay, but if you exceed half a month with your chemical, don't complain if you run into big problems. All right. Okay, I explained to you this rotation can restore efficacy of the anticoccidial. You will ask to me, how much can I expect from that? Well, there is in fact not so much scientific data that demonstrates this. There's some, but one of the ones that I refer most to is the work from David Chapman, who's also a good friend of mine, which is a very famous coccidiosis researcher, and he did a fantastic trial. He was using a chicken house, and he checked in that chicken house the population of coccidiosis before his experiment and at the end of his experiment. And his experiment took 10 months. And these 10 months, he had 5 cycles of chickens grown in that farm. And he checked the sensitivity against salinomycin before and after running the 5 cycles. This was an experiment. He didn't use any anticoccidial in his grow outs. He didn't care about feed conversion rate, about average daily gain, about mortality, because this was purely an experiment. But he could show that he had a 25% restoration of efficacy of the parasites after 10 months compared to before. So if he then was testing the salinomycin after 10 months, he could see it was working 25% better than before he started to give that rest to salinomycin. Okay? You will say, is that not a little bit disappointing? Yes, maybe it's disappointing, but 25%, I explained, as long as we don't drop below that 20-25% efficacy, we still have quite sufficient results in field conditions. Okay, I try to be as high as possible, and I can tell you the 25% makes me very happy. If I start from 25% and go to 50% efficacy with the Ionophore, I'm very happy. But obviously, I think you will agree with me that the restoration is slow, and I prefer to be ahead of that loss of efficacy. That is also why I do this rotation, to prevent that resistance to happen. Another rule that I use, another trick that I use, is cleanup programs as part of strategic coccidiosis control programs in broilers. Cleanup means that we will push the number of oocysts of parasites down in the population by using a very strong chemical. Okay, so we will reduce the infection pressure. We will boost the performance because we'll have less loss of subclinical coccidiosis. Yeah? You will say, why don't we all the time do a cleanup program? Well, you know the answer already. Because if you start to use your chemicals too long, you will run into resistance. Yeah? But for short periods in time, I will use a chemical program to clean up my farm, to reduce the infection pressure, to boost the performance. So how does it look like? This is time, this is the oocyst number, the infection pressure. I will use ionophores because they have a slow development of resistance. They gradually, because of the coccidial leakage, they will allow a building up of the infection pressure. But I'm not so much afraid of full resistance because that goes very slow. And I have my antibacterial effect of my ionophores. After a moment in time, I'm not happy anymore with the subclinical coccidiosis program. So I will use a cleanup cycle where I will use my anticoccidial to reduce the infection pressure, to boost the performance. If I have vaccination in my arsenal of arms, that is also the moment to use my vaccination to restore the sensitivity of the anticoccidials used before, and then return to ionophores, which are usually cheaper and more cost-effective than the chemicals and then the vaccines. Okay, so I'm trying to maximize my ionophore usage. I'm trying to use strategically my chemicals, and if needed, I will also include my vaccines to be included. So this is from cycle to cycle, grow out from grow out. Within one grow out, we also have 2 ways of dealing with anticoccidials. We have what we call a dual program or a shuttle program, and there within one grow out, one flock, This means that we will use two different coccidiostats. For instance, starter and grower, one anticoccidial, finisher, a second anticoccidial. If you use a full program or a straight program, this means we'll use an anticoccidial from the start until finish. We'll use the same anticoccidial. Both of them can work very well. Usually, if you have high infection pressure because of climate or conditions of historic infection pressure, usually then people will switch more to dual programs. If you don't have too high infection pressure, you have really good rotation programs in the past, you have not a lot of resistance, you can be very successful with a straight or full program. Very often people ask me, what kind of program is the best? And then some companies will say, oh, this product is the best in a program with starter and then finisher, use that one. For me, it really depends on the situation. I work with a lot of different types of programs depending on situation, because I try to understand for each of them what are the strong points and what are the weak points. Ionophores, full program, have a slow development of resistance. They allow immunity to build up. Remember the coccidial leakage. This means they are allowing the immune system to recognize the parasites. So they will work a little bit like a vaccination, and this immune system will help the not 100% effective ionophore to really have a good control. And on top of that, we have an antibiotic activity. A full chemical program. I love it because I can reduce my infection pressure. But the negative point is that we have a risk of outbreak of resistance. So why don't we combine them? We put in the starter phase, we put a chemical, and then we put ionophore in the finisher phase. The big advantage here is that even if there's resistance to this chemical, it will not occur in the moment where the birds have the highest feed intake, where the consequences on feed conversion rate will be the most impressive, or when the infection of the coccidiosis at highest, which is between 21 and 35 days. But why not reversing that idea? Why don't we use ionophore chemical program? It means that in the beginning, the first 3 weeks of life, we are allowing the parasites to shed a little bit, to build up immunity partially. And then when there's a high feed intake, we use the strongest product to push down the infection pressure. It can work really well. Especially when you have a chemical with a 0-day withdrawal time, that means we can use them at the very end of the program. Ionophore, this is something that, for me, from a technical point of view, I don't like so much, because you will teach the parasites resistance against two types of ionophores at the same time. Sometimes it might be inspired by cost optimization. For instance, you use a more expensive ionophore at the starter phase, a cheaper one in the finisher phase. But from a technical point of view, there's not so much advantage there. And then a chemical shuttle. You have a similar cleanup effect like here with this full chemical, but you divide the risk over two chemical classes. And I have been very successfully in the last 10 years. I'm applying a lot of the famous three-way chemical shuttle programs, where there will be 3 different chemicals without cross-resistance being used in the starter phase, grower phase, and finisher phase, especially if you have a 0-day withdrawal time for the last chemical. And I will put my more expensive chemicals in my starter phase. I can have a very cost-effective, efficient cleanup program that I can run longer than one in a full with one chemical, because the risk for resistance is a lot reduced by using 3 chemicals in the same moment. But of course, the disadvantage is that you will teach the parasites partially how to become resistant against these 3 classes at the same time. So basic rules for coccidiosis control. If you design a program, design it for 2 years, not for 2 months, not for 6 months, not for 1 year. You have to work with longer periods, and I design my programs for 2 years. I look back in time 2 years, and I look for 2 years, what am I going to use? I never have to change my program. Very rarely, if something unforeseen happens, but in the vast majority of the programs I make, we don't have to change. If it is well designed, I don't have to change my program for the next 2 years. If you follow the rule not to use the same anticoaxidiant for long periods, after using a product, allow long enough rest. And don't say, I want to have my restoration of sensitivity. Remember the salinomycin trial, 10 months resting gives you 25%. Okay. I will rest my products at minimum 6 months. Okay. When rotate between classes, not just products. Don't go from salinomycin brand A to salinomycin brand B. That doesn't make any sense. If you use a chemical cleanup, use it at least once during a 2 years period, ideally just before vaccination if you apply vaccination. Yeah? And then, what is your optimal duration of program in broilers? Ionophore up to 6 months. Chemical full program, 3 months max, which is 1 cycle. Chemical in a shuttle program, using 2 chemicals, 4 months max. Using 3 chemicals, you can go up to 5 to 6 months. Okay. Vaccination, 2 to 4 cycles, depending on the situation and the type of vaccine. Okay. And advise resting periods after using Ionophore or that same class, at least for 6 months, and reduce use of a certain chemical to once every 2 years. Conclusions. All product types, Ionophores, chemical vaccines, they have advantages and disadvantages. If somebody say, yeah, you should be using vaccines, you should be using a chemical, you should be using Ionophore, you should be using this combination product. This is not logic. What they should talk to you about is that with this product, my disadvantage is this, my advantage is that. If they say this, you know they talk the truth. Also, don't believe when they say there's one single best solution. No. There's not a single product that can be implemented on its own without losing the performance on the long term. If it's Ionophore, it is because the gradual buildup of the infection pressure. If it's a chemical, it's because of a gradual buildup of resistance. If it's a vaccine, it's because you instigate a increased infection pressure with subclinical coccidiosis. Okay, but combining them, rotating them, you are able to minimize the disadvantages and maximize the advantages, and that is what you need. Okay, so that is why rotation is the crucial strategy for optimization of anticoccidial programs. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. If you want to do some further reading, go to our website. But obviously, you can also reach out to our colleagues of Provet, and they will also transmit the questions that you have later on to us. But I'm also happy to answer some questions right now, of course. So I know it's late for you already. It's not so late for me, so I'm still very active. But I'm very happy to answer some questions if you still have some time. Dr. Ajay.
Right. Thank you, Maarten. Can you please stop sharing? Yeah, right. Thank you. So that was a very wonderful session, Maarten. And I know it is very difficult to control you when it's anticoccidial or rotation of this program. But you have finished within just 5 minutes or 10 minutes different. But even we also, I feel the participant also were unaware about the timing. They were so interested in this topic. So you keep them engaged, and your energy was unparalleled. Really, it was a wonderful energy. So before taking question and answer session, I would just like to have some of this one because I would like to discuss or share with the farmer, the participant that Provet Pharma is continuously endeavoring to provide a complete solution for the sustainable and as well as sustainable solutions. And I would like to take you way back in 2009 when Provet Pharma has first time in India brought the anticoccidial rotation or shuttle program concept with the help of Alpharma. And I would be very happy to inform you that Dr. Maarten was instrumental in doing all these. He has roamed in the total India. He has conducted so many intestinal lesion scoring, then oocyst count. So continuously he has done, and I will continue to that. I am very happy to inform you that from Provet Pharma Private Limited, we are also continuing this process with all over India with our technical team, and we are also providing this technical services like intestinal lesion scoring, oocyst count, and giving farmers and the anticoccidial rotation and shuttle program. This one, and I really wonder how many farmers are really following the anticoccidial rotation program.
That's
Because
great to hear. That's great
yeah,
to hear.
yeah, and because unless you judiciously follow the anticoccidial rotation or shuttle program, you will have to face clinical coccidiosis and as well as subclinical coccidiosis, which will be eating away of your profit. And due to the indiscriminate use of the molecules and particularly the generic molecules, where there is no control on the quality, has led to the so many subclinical cases of the coccidiosis. And Provet Pharma is in the forefront for providing complete gut health solution. We have a broad range of anticoccidials like salinomycin, motheromycin with nicarbazine, chemicals like propitol, robenadine, diclazuril, and for treatment purpose amprolium and vitamin K, as well as we have a broad range of antibiotic growth promoters as well as symbiotics, probiotics, prebiotics, essential oils, bacteriophages. So we, as a complete solution provider, we are trying to emerge. So thank you. I would like to take the question. This is one question. If we want to prevent oversupply of nutrients in the intestinal lumen, what changes do you suggest in the broiler feed, pre-starter, starter, and finisher? I think this may not be directly related with coccidiosis,
No, no,
but
no. It's a good question. What we try to avoid mainly is an excess of the protein content. Okay, so how can you? Well, first of all, we don't really want to. Are you still there? Okay. We don't really want to reduce that too much, of course. Otherwise, we would lose growth. But we've in the first place we want to prevent the fact that there is damage that, for instance, with coccidiosis or with mycotoxins or with viruses, there is damage to the gut so that the absorptive capacity stays as high as possible. Okay, so that is the first attempt, because then we can reach the genetic potential of the bird without giving in growth rates. But if you say no, but every farm has coccidiosis, so we have to live with that. And you see this bacterial enteritis coming back, and you want to do something about nutrition. Well, it's typically going to be by facilitating the speed of absorption of your protein. And what I typically see as a common mistake, not mistake, when I see most problems, it is very often when people have to go to very high crude protein contents in order to achieve top growth. If that crude protein does not get digested and absorbed properly, that will give you the highest problems with bacterial enteritis and necrotic enteritis. Okay, so especially
right.
not only in the starter phase but also in the other phases. All right.
Okay.
Next question.
Right. Right. Thank you. This question was raised by Dr. Sudhir Updikar sir, and hope Martin could able to satisfy your answer. Another question is from Dr. Yusuf Patel. Is tolterazuril treatment safe for broiler breeders 25-week onwards in laying stage for production, hatchability, and chick quality?
Yes. Tolterazuril is for us the standard treatment. It's for me the standard treatment for broiler breeders. So you can use it without issues. Okay.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another question is from Mr. Ramesh Krishnan. What could be the reason for occurring sickle coxy than other species in the breeders?
If you see more Sickle species, it could be purely coincidence, or it could be you're not seeing so easily the other species. The other species are less easy to diagnose, they are easier to miss. What I would recommend, but it's possible that you only have Sickle species, but then it's purely coincidence. But usually when we see more Sickle coccidiosis, we also see more intestinal coccidiosis. So I think it is a diagnostic question. Try maybe to do some oocyst counting, to do some differentiation, and try also to see how the lesions look like in the small intestine. Maybe look a little bit earlier. I don't know, of course, this is in breeders, this is in producing breeds, I don't know the age, but very often it will be yeah, not only the Sickle coccidiosis that is the problem, but maybe try to look a bit earlier. Maybe you're going to see this intestinal species a little bit earlier than the Sickle one. So I think it's more a perception here than a fact, because we don't really see the Sickle problems higher in breeders than with other species. But obviously, the Sickle ones, if you talk about Necatrix, if you talk about Brunetti, let's say not only Sickle but also the hind gut, and the Tenella, Necatrix, and Brunetti, as are the more pathogenic ones, they are of course more visible at the breeder level. When the birds come into lay, they have a drop of the immune system. So even when they were immune at the end of the year, we might see these very spectacular outbreaks. And if it's with an Acephalina, you will never notice because they will not be so spectacular. Okay.
Right. Thank you. Continue to the in vaccinated flock, can we use anticoaxidia like toltrazuril for preventive purposes in the vaccinated flock?
Yeah. Yes. You can, but don't. You have to understand the risk. Okay, so it is very commonly done with vaccines that are virulent, like the Coxyvac D type of vaccine. They are more. Of course, this was a short session. I have more information on this, but there's two types of vaccines. There's the attenuated ones that don't cause that much damage, and there's the more virulent ones, like the Coxyvac D, and they cause more damage. And this is very common to cool down the vaccine by using toltrazuril, sulfonamides, amprolium. If you do that to cool down, realize that you might knock out some of the more difficult to replicate species, especially Necatrix and Brunetti. So it's not ideal. The ideal is that you can vaccinate without having to cool down the vaccine. That could be by the choice of the vaccine. It could be by your litter management. But be careful, especially, let's say, the first 6 weeks after vaccination, because this is the moment that you want to generate immunity. All right. If it's later than 6-8 weeks after vaccination, you shouldn't worry too much, because there, if you see some Coxy, it means that the vaccine, it's not vaccine anymore, it's field strain. There might be some birds that were not well vaccinated. It's okay then for you to use this treatment. In the production, there's no point in not treating, because then the vaccine should have done the job already for a long time. If that is not the case, it could be immunosuppression. Then you're just helping the immune system to cope with the Coxy infection, or the vaccination was not so successful. So then you have to just go for the treatment. Okay, so it depends a little bit on the period. It means the further you're away from your vaccination, the safer it is to use your anticoccidial treatment.
Great. Thank you. And there's one more question. Like in India, the Coxy vaccine is not much, I should say, popular instead of success. So they're not much popular. May I know the reason in Indian condition why we are not getting a good response or good results, or there is the popularity of the vaccine usage, why it's not gaining?
Sorry, what was the question? I understand the introduction, but then I just lost you at the question.
Okay. Why in Indian condition, why the anticoccidial vaccine is not getting popularity?
I don't know. It's there could be a big number of reasons why the vaccines are not cost effective. One of them is the type of vaccine. If you have a very virulent vaccine, like I explained in the presentation, you can have loss of subclinical coccidiosis, so you could have loss of performance. So it could be the type of vaccine. It could be that your anticoccidials have very high efficacy, so the added value of the vaccination is not there. It could be that the application is not done very properly. There could be also something else. It could be that you don't have such high pressure for all the species, and if you use a vaccine, you will introduce all the species that maybe are not present in the farm, or it could simply be that the marketing purpose, the marketing of the producers of the vaccine producing companies is not so effective. Yeah, it's
Fine.
it could be a multiple of
Yeah, yeah.
technical reasons or just purely commercial marketing reasons.
Fine.
Okay.
Right. Thank you. Is there any chemical anticoccidial that can be used in breeders after 18 weeks of in the breeders?
Okay, in feed. You're talking about in feed, eh?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Be careful. First of all, you have to look at the legal aspects, but I'm not talking about legal aspects. I'm not a specialist in the registrations of the Anticoaxidia in India, but from a technical point of view only, eh, there are a couple of chemicals that do really good job during first, let's say if you say I have some pressure of coccidiosis between 20 and 30 weeks of age. There are some molecules that I have been working with in the past in countries where that was possible with a really good result. I give an example. Diclazolone, for instance, is very safe for egg production and it can do a good job. But you have to be careful. Some molecules are really destroying hatchability completely. For instance, nicarbazine is very well known to to prevent fertilization of the eggs. So if you would use a nicarbazine, you would have a disaster. For instance, with the diclazolone, just one example. There is more example. Amprolium also could be used. So it depends. But yes, if legally possible, that sometimes is a very pragmatic and good solution to bypass that temporary immune drop that we have with the breeders, right? Even if they were immune at 17 weeks, we very often, because of this hormonal changes, we very often have a peak of coccidiosis problems the first 10 weeks of production.
Right. Thank you. This question was asked by Dr. Dilip Wagmare. Another question from Dr. Vinod Koskewar. What should be the ideal cleanup program?
Well, the ideal cleanup program is one that is safe, cheap, and not causing any resistance. So this is what we try to achieve. I gave you a hint in the presentation.
Yeah.
Some of the molecules, like if you, for instance, take nicarbazine. Nicarbazine is a very popular molecule. I use it in all my programs. I'm using nicarbazine. But nicarbazine has some disadvantages. At later age, even at 14 days in fast-growing broilers, starting from 14 days, especially when we have hot season, this can cause some slowing down in growth and even some mortality. So this is a molecule I will put in my starter phase. Okay, I will then, for the cleanup program, I will then make a shuttle after starter phase with a molecule that is less expensive, not to, and that I will use, for instance, another 12 days, 14 days. And then the last part of my chemical program, so I use a lot of these three-way chemical programs, I will go for one that is cheaper and that typically has a 0-day withdrawal time, so I can use it until the end. Decokinate, fantastic molecule, but very expensive. I like to use decokinate at 40 ppm. Will I put the decokinate at 40 ppm at my finisher phase? Oh my God, no, I will not do that. That will just, my cost will go through the roof, right? So this is a molecule I will put in my starter phase also. If I want to use that, I will put it in my starter phase. So it's really a combination. It depends on what you have available. It depends on the cost of the anticoccidial. It depends on the history. If you are doubting, for instance, a certain molecule, maybe I have overused it in the past. For instance, diclazolone, it's easy resistance against diclazolone. Maybe you had some problems before. Well, I might not put it in my highest risk period of my age of my birds. I might put it in the starter phase. Even if it doesn't do the job there, it will not be a disaster. And then for duration of the how many cycles I will use this. So if it's a full program, if I only use one chemical, just one cycle. But if I use 2 or 3-way combos, I will use 2 to 3 cycles. I can use this cleanup. You will see fantastic results. Your performance will be boosted if you, of course, if you have the efficacy of these chemicals there. Okay.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Uh, is the cleanup program with chemicals? If you use different chemicals like clopidol, diclazuril, or robenadone, is the same activity?
Yeah.
Does
Well, it depends on your historic use, of course. But originally, all these molecules have this knockdown effect on the parasites, and they work excellent. Of course, depending on how often you have used diclazuril or clopidol or decaquinate in the past in your farms, there could be acquired resistance. Okay, I cannot judge that. Principally, inherently, the efficacy is very similar to all the chemicals, but because of they are a very long time on the market, for your situation, it could be different than for your neighbor, but in general, they are very similar.
right? If at all we are doing vaccine, which is the best season for vaccination?
Yeah. The, okay, if you have a very high infection pressure with a lot of problems because of resistance, I never wait for my vaccination to start. I just start using it. I know it's not the ideal season, eh? But I will implement it right away because I'm losing too much money by staying on my old program. Okay. On the other hand, if I have time, if my situation is not so dramatic, I prefer to use my vaccine when there's a low number of resistant parasites present. And when is that? That is typically in your dry season. Again, it's very much regional dependent. If you're in Kerala, it's going to be different than if you're in the center of the country. But if you have a dry season where you know your infection pressure is lower, this is the preferred time to use the vaccine. Why? Because at this period, the competition with the resistant strains is more easily won by the vaccine strain. Okay?
Right. Okay. So, is there any drug of choice like Ionophore or chemicals as treatment option of each kind of Eimeria? Like species wise, is there any specific treatment?
That's a tricky question because when we are looking back in time, 50 years ago, and these drugs were originally launched on the markets, there were some strengths and some weaknesses for each of the molecules. I give you an example. Lactaloside was pretty well known for its poor Asavolina efficacy, but excellent Tenella efficacy. Okay. In the meantime, because there's so many years of use, you have to be careful with this kind of general knowledge. Because in your farm, it could be that Asavolina was never very prevalent, and the efficacy is still quite okay with your lactalosids. And your Tenella, there has been a lot of contact between Tenella and lactalosids, and your lactaloside efficacy against Tenella has gone down. But originally, there were a couple of, it would take me too far here to say which ones are better for what. But yes, there has been some, when they were launched, the products, they had some image of better for Tenella or weaker for Maxima or weaker for Asavolina. Today, I would suggest don't look at that features. Look at the historic use of your molecules in your farms in order to define the choice of drug combined with your prevalence data that you have. Okay.
Right. Thank you. Can I take 1, 2, 3 more questions?
Sure, you can. Sure,
right,
you can.
Right. Okay. Now, for the treatment purpose, generally we use sulfonamides, and you know sulfonamides will lead to anemia. So, is it suggestible to use sulfonamides, and if at all, for how long?
Yeah. Okay. Good question again. It depends a little bit on the sulfonamide, of course. You have the first generation sulfonamides had a stronger anemic effects. So there you have to be more careful. The more there are a couple of sulfonamides where we don't have that dramatic problems with anemia. But again, it always has to do with the time of use. And when you use it specific for coccidiosis control, try to work with a regime where you will have a on-off type of usage. So don't use longer than 5 days for sure. But usually what we will do is we will use 2 days, then 3 days not, 2 days, 3 days not, or 3 days, 2 days not, 3 days, 2 days not, so that the anemic effect doesn't occur. And also because you have a lower cost instead of using continuously. It's a second reason, because your sulfonamides work coccidiostatic. So I didn't explain that in this presentation, but the coccidiostatic compound means that you will stop the development of the parasites. The cycle will be arrested, but the parasite will not be per se killed by the action of the molecule. It is the immune system that will kill the parasites. That's exactly what you want. You want immunity, right? So your sulfonamide will slow down the action, your immune system will kick in and will kill the parasite, and then on off like that. That is a very good way of working. By the way, not only with your sulfonamides, also with your ampollum, for instance. This is a good way of using it, because in this way you avoid anemia, but also you reduce your cost and you have the immune system to kick in.
Right. Thank you. How about usage of clopidol in broiler breeders during laying?
I don't have experience with clopidol in laying phase. I can't answer that question. I don't. I'm pretty sure there is a manuals of toxicity. It's easy to find back in literature if there has been an experiment before effect of a lay. But I have not checked it. I have never used it in lay.
Right. Thank you. I just want to take two last questions. After treatment of coccidiosis in broilers, how many days will it take to restore the epithelial villi?
Okay, 24 to 48 hours. If the parasite is gone, of course you have a reinfection, it will destroy again. Okay. But if there's no reinfection, if you have good control, 24 to 48 hours.
Fine.
It goes very quickly, very quickly.
Yeah. Can we replace litter at the time of outbreak, Coxy outbreak? Can we replace the litter?
Absolutely, you can. The question will be, will it not be too late? Yes, it will be too late. But you can do that. I know what I think the background of the question, if I may, Dr. Milind, I think the question is: do we sometimes promote outbreak of coccidiosis by replacing litter? That has sometimes been suggested, and there is a possibility that when you turn litter, you will have the oocysts that are, let's say, accumulated in the litter. You put them on the top, easy to reach for the birds to pick. This could be, an explanation why sometimes we see after turning litter, you see more problems with the Coxy. Of course, if you just add litter on top, this will not be the case usually, because you will bury the oocysts below, but then you will have other problems of trapping the humidity in that caked litter, so you will have other problems. But yes, you can replace litter at time of outbreak without any problem.
Great, thank you. And one more last question I will just add to. You already cleared that no disinfectant works ideally against coccidiosis, but what measure before placing the birds? What measure should we use?
What?
Like a cleaning procedure. What cleaning procedure or what molecule you want to suggest?
Yeah. Okay.
To reduce at least the burden.
Yeah. So there's a number of compounds that can, of course, washing out. That is the most effective. So just removing the oocysts with a lot of water. And then the next best thing is burning. Okay, so I told you burning or freezing. In your country, freezing is a little bit hard to achieve, I think. In
Very
some
difficult.
countries, we would just open the gates and just let the frost get in. That also works pretty well.
Okay.
But in your country, I think burning is a much better alternative, of course.
Yes.
But then for the rest, I know there's a couple of methods with ammonium, with cresols that have been described in literature. Personally, I don't put my money and my time in that. Okay, because I have always seen that they are very frustrating in terms of efficacy, especially if you don't change your anticoaxial program. And I will explain you with that with an example. It is not because have you reduced your infection pressure at the time of growth that your birds are not vulnerable during the grow out of the animals. The best example for that is what we call the new house syndrome. The new house syndrome, that is this farmer which is really proud because he has built a completely new farm. And you know what he will say? He say, it's my new farm. For sure, the first couple of cycles, my results will be top. There's no infection pressure on this farm, no viruses, no parasites, no bacteria. My performance will be top. This farmer starts off full of trust, full of confidence. And after 2 weeks, Tenella outbreak. What is the explanation for that? So just explaining what it means. He started with 0 oocysts in his farm. 0 oocysts in the farm. Brand new farm. What happened is that what happens in a normal farm, there is a gradual balance, a build-up of immunity together with the Anticoaxidials. Okay, that's what I explained with the Ionophores. They had to do some leakage, they work a little bit, the birds start to recognize and react against the parasites. In this brand new farm, there was some kind of introduction by whatever, feed delivery or people, and there was a batch of Coccidia that was introduced in the birds that were completely naive. And all of a sudden, this parasite starts to spread very rapidly, and they can cause even more problems than in a farm that is very old. That is an example, is an extreme example where you have achieved 0 oocysts at the start of your production, because there was never birds before, and still you have a dramatic outcome of your production. It is explaining the importance of the good effect of your anticoaxials in the feed. That is a lot more important than your clean out procedures. Why? Because the parasite is the most vulnerable when it's inside the bird, when you can attack it there with the immune system or with anticoaxials or with a combination of the two.
Right. Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate your patience. You have completely in depth provided all the insights regarding the questions. And now I hand over the session to Stephen.
It was a great and engrossing session as usual. So we are, as usual, even Dr. Rajesh shared, we are astounded by your passion, energy, and the interest in your subject, the knowledge you have. Thanks, Dr. Martin, and thanks to all the audience for patiently listening through the session and posting their questions. Thanks to all the audience for being here, and especially thanks to the Almighty and nature for allowing Dr. Ajay to be present continuously through the session, because it's raining cats and dogs in Hyderabad. So
huge rain, heavy rains.
Heavy rains. Yeah. So thanks everybody. Thank you, Dr. Ajay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Martin.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you. See you next time.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, Dr. Martin.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. I am also thankful for all the participants. Thank you. Goodbye. So we are signing off.